Mein Name ist Andrea Grotzel. Ich bin Bildungsreferentin bei Spiegelbild, politische Bildung aus Wiesbaden. Und wir sind sehr froh, eine gemeinsame Kooperation mit dem kommunalen Frauenreferat Wiesbaden getroffen zu haben und auszubauen. Heute personifiziert hier die Frauenbeauftragte Frau Saskia Veit-Prank und Manuela Schon. Wo steht sie? Da hinten. Wir haben nämlich gemeinsam begonnen, jetzt uns mit dem Thema der Istanbul-Konvention gemeinsam auseinanderzusetzen und ein Konzept zu entwickeln, wie die Istanbul-Konvention in Wiesbaden sichtbarer sein kann, wie gegen Violence Against Women gearbeitet werden kann, wie wir Männer adressieren können, sich mit sich auseinanderzusetzen und zu stärken, genauso auch wie wir Frauen dazu einbeziehen können. Und wir haben einen großartigen Start gehabt, und zwar 2 Workshop-Tage mit Jackson Katz, gestern und heute als Team Spiegelbild. Und was heute Abend noch passiert, das ist das, was auch hoffentlich in der Stadt bleiben kann und weiter Früchte tragen wird. Ich danke sehr für diese gemeinsame Kooperation. Ein weiteres Dankeschön geht natürlich an den Schlachthof, der es uns ermöglicht, heute hier zu sein und so viel Women and Manpower hier reingestellt hat, die Räume zur Verfügung stellt und hier am Hin und Her aufbauen ist, weil auch hier nach später noch eine Disco-Veranstaltung ist. Aber Sie haben es möglich gemacht, dass wir heute hier sein werden, und auch dafür ein herzliches Dankeschön. Den ersten inhaltlichen Übertrag würde ich jetzt an Manuela Schon richten. Liebe Manu, herzlich willkommen, komm zu mir auf die Bühne. Und Manu wird einführen einmal in die inhaltliche Ausrichtung Istanbul-Konvention und was heißt das eigentlich oder was bedeutet das für Wiesbaden und für uns.
Vielen Dank, Andrea. Der Kampf gegen männliche Gewalt an Mädchen und Frauen hat beim Kommunalen Frauenreferat der Landeshauptstadt Wiesbaden seit langer Zeit eine hohe Priorität. Ein Leben frei von Gewalt ist eng verbunden mit einer vollen Partizipation an der Gesellschaft. Männliche Gewalt gegen Frauen bringt weitreichende Einschränkungen, beispielsweise in Bezug auf mentale und physische Gesundheit, das Erwerbsleben oder die finanzielle Sicherheit mit sich. Mit der Ratifizierung des Europaratsabkommens zur Verhütung und Bekämpfung von Gewalt gegen Frauen und häuslicher Gewalt erhalten Frauen und ihre mitbetroffenen Kinder erstmalig einen Rechtsanspruch auf ein Leben frei von Gewalt und auf bestmöglichen Schutz und spezialisierte Unterstützung. Es war ein sehr weiter Weg von den in der Frauenbewegung als Hilfe von Frauen für Frauen gegründeten Unterstützungseinrichtungen, den autonomen Frauenhäusern, Beratungsstellen, über die Gewährung von freiwilligen kommunalen Leistungen an die Einrichtungen bis zum heutigen völkerrechtlich verbindlichen Rechtsanspruch auf Schutz und Unterstützung und eben auch der Verpflichtung des Staates, hier Verantwortung übernehmen zu müssen. Trotz guter sozialer Infrastruktur zur Unterstützung von gewaltbetroffenen Frauen, immer noch nicht perfekt, ist alles immer ausbaufähig, aber trotzdem sehr gut, kommen wir nicht umhin festzustellen, dass wir ein Problem haben. Die repräsentativen Gewaltprävalenzstudien von 2004 und 2015 zeigen uns, dass es uns nicht gelingt, Gewalt von Männern gegen Frauen effektiv zu bekämpfen und diese nach wie vor ein endemisches Ausmaß hat. Während der Corona-Pandemie wurde von der Schattenpandemie gesprochen. Mehr als die Hälfte der weiblichen Bevölkerung wird im Laufe ihres Lebens Opfer von psychischer, häuslicher oder sexueller Gewalt. Hinzu kommen weibliche Genitalverstümmelung, Zwangsverheiratung, Zwangssterilisation und Zwangsabtreibung, die von der Konvention umfassten Gewaltformen geschlechtsspezifischer Gewalt. Die Landeshauptstadt Wiesbaden gehört zu den ersten Kommunen bundesweit, die eine lokale Koordinierungsstelle zur Umsetzung der Konvention eingerichtet hat. Auch dies zeigt, das Thema genießt hier eine hohe politische Priorität. Die Istanbul-Konvention gilt als der Goldstandard im Kampf gegen geschlechtsspezifische Gewalt gegen Mädchen und Frauen. Sie verfolgt einen allumfassenden Ansatz und sie stellt einen ganzen, auf wissenschaftlicher Evidenz beruhenden Werkzeugkoffer zur Verfügung. Während sie einerseits den Staat in die Verpflichtung nimmt, verfolgt sie aber vor allem auch einen gesamtgesellschaftlichen Ansatz. Sie betont die Verantwortung der gesamten Gesellschaft, von Medienschaffenden oder Privatunternehmen gleichermaßen wie von jedem einzelnen Mitglied der Gesellschaft und formuliert hier: Herz und Verstand der Menschen, die mit ihrem Verhalten zum Fortbestand der von der Konvention umfassten Gewaltformen beitragen, sollen erreicht werden. Da zahlreiche in den Anwendungsbereich des Übereinkommens fallende Formen von Gewalt überwiegend von Männern und Jungen begangen werden, wird es als wichtig erachtet, deren besondere Rolle bei der Verhütung der Taten hervorzuheben. Hierbei soll auch auf den potenziellen Vorbildcharakter von nicht gewalttätigen Jungen und Männern gesetzt werden. Sie können die Rolle eines Vorreiters für Veränderungen und eines Befürworters für die Gleichstellung von Frauen und Männern sowie des gegenseitigen Respekts einnehmen. Sie können Gewalt anprangern und versuchen, andere Männer in entsprechende Aktivitäten einzubeziehen. Es gilt deshalb, praktische Lösungen anzubieten, wie Individuen ihren ganz eigenen persönlichen Beitrag leisten können. Der Primärprävention kommt hier eine große Bedeutung zu und wir freuen uns sehr über die Kooperation mit Spiegelbild, dem Träger Spiegelbild Politische Bildung in Wiesbaden. Denn Spiegelbild verfügt über ein fundiertes fachliches Wissen zur Diskriminierung und leistet mit seiner Arbeit seit vielen, vielen Jahren einen wertvollen Beitrag in dieser Stadt. Wir sind überzeugt davon, dass von hier zukünftig wichtige Impulse in die Stadtgesellschaft auch zu diesem Thema ausgehen können. Und auf die Arbeit unseres heutigen Redners, Dr. Jackson Katz, bin ich 2014 auf einer großen Konferenz mit mehreren tausend Teilnehmerinnen im schwedischen Malmö aufmerksam geworden. Die bahnbrechende Bedeutung seiner Arbeit war mir sofort bewusst. Und es erfüllt mich und uns mit großer Freude und auch Stolz, dass er unserer Einladung gefolgt ist und heute erstmalig in Deutschland außerhalb eines militärischen Kontextes spricht. Die von ihm entwickelten Programme werden seit vielen Jahrzehnten in den USA und vielen anderen Ländern angewandt. Und wir freuen uns heute, davon auch profitieren zu können und auch in dem Workshop in den letzten 2 Tagen. Wir freuen uns auch, dass Sie und ihr der Einladung zu der Veranstaltung heute gefolgt sind und laden Sie herzlich ein, Teil des Wandels zu sein für Mädchen und Frauen, aber auch die anwesenden Männer für sich selbst. Wir wünschen allen einen erkenntnisreichen Abend, denn gemeinsam können wir die Veränderung sein. Vielen Dank.
Dankeschön, liebe Manu. Bevor ich zur Vorstellung von Jackson Katz komme, also wer ist eigentlich Dr. Jackson Katz, möchte ich noch einer Person danken, die nämlich maßgeblich diese gesamte Veranstaltung, die Workshop-Tage und auch heute die Veranstaltung für Spiegelbild organisiert, geplant und ausgestaltet hat. Und ich bitte um einen riesigen Applaus für meine liebe Kollegin, Frau Jana Müller. Durch sie wächst dieses Projekt inhaltlich und kommt auch das als Thema bei Spiegelbild ins Team und auch in die inhaltliche Auseinandersetzung, wofür wir ihr sehr dankbar sind. Vielen Dank dafür. Jackson Katz. Ich muss ein bisschen ablesen, ich wollte es kurz halten, aber leider ist es sehr lang, weil es gibt viel zu Dr. Jackson Katz zu sagen. Jackson Katz hat einen PhD in Kulturwissenschaften, ist US-amerikanischer Pädagoge, ehemaliger Highschool-Footballstar, Autor, Aktivist und Filmemacher und ein Vordenker in der Arbeit mit Männern, die sich für die Gleichstellung der Geschlechter und die Verhinderung geschlechtsspezifischer Gewalt einsetzen. 1993 gründete Dr. Jackson Katz das Programm Mentors in Violence Prevention, MVP, welches eines der am längsten laufenden und einflussreichsten gemischtgeschlechtlichen Präventionsprogramme gegen sexuelle Übergriffe und Beziehungsmissbrauch ist. Sowohl in Nordamerika, aber auch darüber hinaus arbeitet er in diesem Rahmen und vor allem im Profisportbereich und allen Zweigen des US-Militärs. Eine besondere Errungenschaft des MVP-Programms ist dabei die Einführung und Strategie des Bystander Approach, über den wir heute noch mehr hören werden. Ansatz im Bereich der Prävention von geschlechtsspezifischer Gewalt. Seit 1990 hat Katz mehr als 1000 Keynotes überall gehalten, sowie Programms und Trainings mit Führungskräften gemacht. und zwar in in allen 50 US-Staaten, in Kanada und so weiter. Katz hat mehrere Bücher herausgegeben, unter anderem das Macho-Paradox, Why Some Men Hurt Women and How All Men Can Help, und ist in zahlreichen TV- und Radioshows aufgetreten. Sein TED-Talk wurde in mehr als 27 Sprachen übersetzt. Ich weiß nicht, wer von Ihnen hat den TED-Talk gesehen oder euch hat den TED-Talk gesehen? Einmal Hand hoch. Schon einige, krass. Genau, der wurde in mehr als 27 Sprachen übersetzt und wurde mehr als 5 Millionen Mal abgespielt. Genau. Er ist ein ehemaliger Highschool-Football-Star, was uns sehr wichtig ist, und ist so ein bisschen auch, glaube ich, dann der Punkt, warum er im Militärbereich und im Sportbereich eigentlich zu finden ist. Von daher, dass er heute hier in Wiesbaden ist und für uns als Gruppe seine Inhalte teilt, ist etwas sehr Besonderes. Deshalb möchte ich jetzt begrüßen und ruhig sein für den Rest des Abends und lauschen. Herzlich willkommen, Dr. Jackson Katz.
I don't know if any of that was true. I hope it was. I recognized my name a few times. So I think that it was accurate, and I appreciate very much. Thank you very much, Andrea. I also want to thank Manuela Schoen for all her leadership. I mean, there was a lot of people who were instrumental in helping to make this trip and this event possible, but Manuela is the person who got it all started. I think she deserves a big round of applause. Thank you, Manuela. And we just did a podcast interview that I'm sure she'll be putting somewhere available in the near future. 12th of July. Okay, good. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank Jana Muller for all her leadership and work and advocacy. I've been here for a few days, and she's been my go-to person the whole time. Thank you. Thank you, Jana. All right, and thank you for coming out. It's a Friday night. As soon as I was told that we were going to do an event in a public space that was voluntary, people could show up or if they wanted to or not, I was like, Friday night? Who comes to an event like this on a Friday night? And I am very impressed. And it's also like the warmest day of the year or something, right? It's pretty warm out there, isn't it? Yes, so I appreciate all of that, and I appreciate you're here. Now, let me just say, I'm going to say some really provocative things this evening because life is short and we have some really big problems in our societies, and hopefully I'll give you some ways of thinking about this issue or this set of issues that might be useful going forward, and we'll certainly have a Q&A in the after I finish my prepared comments, and I'm happy to entertain any comments, questions, pushback. To the extent that we can engage in dialogue, I'm happy to do that, okay? So please know. And please also know that if you find interesting or compelling some of the things that I'm saying, please know that there's so much more where all this comes from. So I'm trying to give you some real highlights, but please know that I'm a person, and there's a lot of other men around the world, including in Germany. And by the way, Spiegelbild, great. I'm so happy to be working with Spiegelbild today and yesterday and the training with all these folks. Thank you. And some of them are here, and I swear to God, they're going to sit through listening to me again after 2 days of listening to me. And I appreciate that. Men's violence against women is a global pandemic and has been a pandemic for long before coronavirus showed up on the scene. Men's violence against women is in every community, in every culture, in every country in the world. I mean, my frame of reference is my country, the United States, obviously, but you have big problems here in Germany. And, you know, these are global problems. And yeah, there's some local issues, and sure, but this stuff is much bigger than any locality, whether it's Wiesbaden or anywhere else in Germany or anywhere else in the world, right? Now, historically, the issues of domestic and sexual violence, and I'm going to use the word gender violence inclusive of domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, the sexual abuse of children, trafficking, sexual exploitation. In other words, I'm going to use the shorthand of gender violence or gender-based violence. But historically, the issues of gender violence have been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. But I have a problem with that frame, and I don't even accept the premise. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues. Now, obviously, they're women's issues. I know this. And women's leadership in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense here in Germany, but all over the world, women's leadership over the past half century and then beyond has been utterly transformative in a world historical level. It's incredible what women have been able to accomplish in just a fairly short amount of time when you consider the long time that our species, Homo sapiens, has been on the planet, between 100 and 200,000 years. The past 50 years have been incredible, the transformations. We have a long way to go, but it's also incredible how far we've come, and women's leadership has made all that possible. Women who do the work often don't get credit for the work that they're doing and the transformative work that they're doing. By the way, not only work that benefits women and girls, which it does, but also men and boys and people who are not men or women, in other words, people beyond the gender binary. Women's leadership in the domestic and sexual violence movement has been one of the best things, let me just say this, one of the best things that's ever happened to men in the world and in history. Women's leadership has transformed men and boys' lives in extraordinarily positive ways, in addition to all the work and all the positive benefits that women and girls have gotten. And if you think that that's a provocative statement, let me just give you 2 data points to make this real, if you would. So for the past quarter century, we've been talking about the effects of domestic violence on children. All the children growing up in homes where their father abuses their mother's boyfriend abuses their mother. Sometimes the mother is the abuser. This is also true in non-heteronormative relationships, the lesbian pairings or gay male pairings or other relationship arrangements where there are children involved. There's an awful lot of children who have been growing up, and to this day as we speak, in homes where they're exposed to, quote, domestic violence, right? And there's a word that people have used in the States, and I understand here as well, to refer to those children. It's called children who witness domestic violence. This is a term, by the way, that I don't like and I don't use. You know why? Because if you're a 7-year-old kid cowering in the closet as your father or another man is raging against your mother, you're not a witness, you're a victim. You're not observing something happening to somebody else, you're experiencing it happening to yourself. The experience of trauma is much more immediate and profound than is suggested by the passive word witness. But guess what? The category of children who are being traumatized in this way includes not just girls, but also boys. Do you have any idea how many boys in the juvenile system in the country of Germany or the state of Hesse or in every state in the United States or elsewhere, how many boys and young men who are in the juvenile system for committing antisocial behavior are in there in part because their life journey started out as traumatized boys and they didn't know what to do other than take the traditional path that we typically give to boys who have been traumatized, which is somebody took something from me, I'm going to take it from somebody else, which is why boys who have been abused are something like 10 times more likely to become abusive of others. The prison system in my country, which is an international shame on my country, the prison system, is filled with chronologically adult men who underneath the bluster and the big badass, tatted up bodies and everything else, underneath that are often little boys, emotionally and developmentally, who developed armor early on in their life as a protective mechanism. And I'm not defending bad behavior by those now chronologically adult men if what got them in the prison system was abusive behavior, violent behavior, antisocial behavior. I'm not excusing it, but I am saying, and I always say this in the States, if we want to undo the system of mass incarceration that has caused such a blight, not just in black communities, although certainly in African-American communities, we have to start talking about violence in the families and with the violence done to boys, not just violence done by boys and men, but violence done to boys. And so much of the violence done to boys takes place in childhood and early adolescence, usually by other men and boys. Let's just be clear about that, right? That's one of the things that feminists have been saying for decades and decades, is that so much of the violence that boys and men suffer is at the hands of other men and boys, right? So basic stuff. And yet, by the way, feminists who talk about this and the domestic violence movement are often talk about this, meaning these set of issues. And the set of issues just relating to domestic violence often get accused of being anti-male or bashing men. Meanwhile, they've been on the side of those boys for decades. They're the ones who are speaking up for boys, girls, and others who have the right to grow up in a family free from violence in the place that's supposed to be a sanctuary from the violence of the outside world, right? Who's been speaking up for those boys? It's been feminist women, among others, feminist women. When's the last time you heard feminist women credited with standing up for boys and young men? Right? You're more likely to hear, oh, they bash men, they hate men, and all this ignorance that gets passed off as common sense in our ignorant discourse. Think I'm mad about this? I am. It's an outrage. And by the way, I think one of the roles that men need to play when we do this work is when you get a stage like I get, when you get a public platform like I get, we should say these kind of things. And we should say that women have been doing this work and they often get shit for it, for just telling the truth. Because some men can't handle the truth. Give me a break. Right? We need more men saying this, don't you think? And if more men would say these kind of things and say it with vigor and passion, it would take some of the pressure off some of these women who get all the kinds of incoming, whether it's online, nasty, threats and death threats and everything else, just for saying women should be treated with respect and dignity, and men and others, right? Why don't we have more men saying these things? Why is it, I'm guessing some of you are probably hearing this for the first time from a man, or at least with this level of passion. I'm also an American, and I understand I'm an American in this room. It's obvious who's the American in this room. And by the way, if in case anybody is wondering, I also know if we're going to talk about mass incarceration, which we're not going to go into in the United States, poverty and racism are also huge systems that have to be sort of understood and then deconstructed. Of course, because that's who ends up in prison, basically, disproportionately people of color and people who are poor. But men are overwhelmingly the people in prison. 95% of people in prison are men, and a huge number of those men are just trauma survivors. And again, I'm not defending bad behavior by them, but if we're kidding ourselves if we think we're going to solve some of these problems without talking about violence done to men. Anyhow, second data point about how women's leadership has helped men. Let's talk about for a moment male sexual abuse victims. So this is something that we've been talking about for the past 20 years or so in a fairly public way in the United States, but here in Germany as well, right? And for example, the Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal, which is a global scandal, started in my home city of Boston, Massachusetts. Men have been sexually abusing boys for thousands of years. This is not a new problem. Thousands of years, but we're only talking about it now for the past 20 or so years in a public way. But who were the first people to talk about male sexual abuse victims and survivors? Who were the first people? You know who it was? It was feminist sexual assault advocates and activists in the 1970s. That's who. And when boys, young men, and men come forward to say that they are going to reclaim the narrative of their life, they're not going to be a victim, they're going to become a survivor, that whole narrative of empowering narrative about taking back sort of control. And I'm not going to be the one shamed because I'm not the one who did the horrible thing. The person who did it should be shamed, but not me. That kind of narrative. The people who walk down that path, the men, the young men and boys who deserve our respect and support and treatment and everything else, they're walking down a path that was blazed, a trail that was blazed years ago by feminist women in the sexual assault and domestic violence movement who did the groundbreaking, trailblazing work to create that space for those men to walk down that path. But when's the last time you heard feminist women credited with giving space to talk about male sexual victimization? You're more likely to hear, oh, these feminists hate men, right? This is ignorance run amok. Once again, contrary to factual, historical data. And we need to say this, and we need to say we honor and respect and support the women who've been doing this work, both back in the day and to this day, and go forward together. God, we have so many problems, and like I said, we need so much more from men. And yet, as I said right at the beginning, the very act of calling these issues women's issues takes us in the wrong direction, because who's doing most of the violence? So let's talk about, for example, rape. And I'm going to use the United States because I don't have at hand German statistics, but I'm guessing it's going to be very similar. Who's committing rape? I'll answer my rhetorical question. Something like 99% of rape is committed by men. People think of rape as a women's issue, but men are committing something like 99%. And you might quibble with that. You might say it's 97%. But why is rape a women? If men are doing it overwhelmingly, why is it a women's issue? I consider calling it a women's issue a subtle form of victim blaming, because the suggestion is that it's a women's issue. It's something women need to deal with. They need to deal with this. They need to take care of themselves. They need to protect themselves. They need to address it. They need to help each other. Really? Is racism a problem for people of color? They have to deal with it. Racism is something that people of color need to deal with. White people don't really have anything to do with racism. That's something for people of color. It's absurd, isn't it? That's like saying heterosexism, about heterosexism. LGBT folks have to deal with discrimination and transphobia, whatever it is, because that's their issue. Are you serious? I mean, people can't be serious about such arguments. But you see what happens. This is sleight of hand rhetorical device to shift accountability off of the group with more power and more perpetration onto the group with less. And one of the things that those of us who want to change the paradigm and change the world, what we need to do is we need to make visible what has been rendered invisible in the discourse, in the conversation, and lift it up and actually be honest and say what's really happening, right? And I'm going to give you a handful of examples of the current way that we're talking about, writing about, and thinking about domestic and sexual violence issues. And again, I'm talking in English, and I appreciate your either hearing me in English or translated. And you can make your own, judgments about how this fits and doesn't fit with German speaking or German language, okay? We so often use the passive voice when we talk about gender-based violence. We'll say things like, how many women were raped in Germany last year or in the state of Hesse last year, rather than how many men raped women. We'll say things like, how many teenage girls in the Wiesbaden school district were sexually harassed last year, rather than how many young men and boys sexually harassed girls in the Wiesbaden school district last year, or how many girls sexually harassed girls or others. I mean, but let's be clear. Or we'll say things like, how many teenage girls in the state of Hesse got pregnant last year, rather than how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls in the state of Hesse last year. In each case, the use of passive language has a very powerful political effect. The political effect is the shift in focus off of the group with more power onto the group with less, which is, by the way, not a coincidence, and it's not sloppy thinking. It's how power works, through stealth or invisibility, or through the shifting of accountability off of itself. You following me? Does this make sense even in English? So even the term violence against women is a term that I don't use. What's missing from the term violence against women? The active agent. In linguistic terms, the active agent is absent. Violence against women is a passive phrase. It's a bad thing that happens to women, violence against them, but nobody's doing it to them. They're just experiencing it, kind of like the weather. But if you insert the active agent, men, you have a new phrase, men's violence against women. It doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but it's more accurate, isn't it? It's more honest. I mean, I used the piece when I did the training with Spiegelbild yesterday. I showed a news piece. It was done by a French TV news organization with their Berlin bureau, and they were doing a piece about femicide in Germany. And it was a long piece. It was like a 15-minute piece, which is really long in TV news. And they practically didn't even mention that men existed. It was like women in Germany are being, sexually assaulted and battered by these ghosts, like this sort of unclear metaphysical presence that's somehow assaulting these women. I'm serious, right? Isn't that true? We watch this, and it's like, can't even say it out loud. How are we going to solve these problems if we can't even say it out loud? There wasn't even one interview with a man. There wasn't even one interview with a woman or a man who works with men who are abusive, who assault women, who abuse their wife or girlfriend. Not even one discussion of it. You know how backward that is, by the way? You know how pathetic that is? That's got to change, doesn't it? Don't you think? Let's have an honest conversation. And by the way, I would never blame women for not using active language and gender-specific language on this subject, right? So men like myself cannot say women should be using active voice and they should be calling it out like it is. That's not fair to put the pressure on women. That's totally illegitimate, in fact, for someone like me, a man, I'm a white guy, et cetera, to do that. It's not fair. Because I think one of the reasons why a lot of women in the work don't use active language and don't say it directly is because they know they're going to get pushback from men. They know that a lot of men can't handle the truth. And so a lot of men will get angry and they'll be sometimes hostile. And if you have to work with men, if you have to work constructively with men, for example, if you're a woman who works in the domestic and sexual violence field and you have to work with the police, and the police, there are women in the police, but police is totally male-dominated space, and you don't want to alienate those guys because you have to work with them, and a lot of women decide it's not worth it. Or women who run programs, they need money from the states, they need from the government, they need to be getting funded, and they have to take care of victims and survivors, and that's their first mission. So they don't want to be seen as the angry feminists who are always bashing men. So they clean up their language and they use gender neutral language. And again, I appreciate that. And by the way, a lot of women in their personal lives have men, friends, maybe a husband or boyfriend, other men. They don't want to be the one always, or colleagues, they don't want to be the one always getting into arguments, always being the one who brings up gender, always the one who says it's a men's issue. And so a lot of those women, they're just like, oh, we have other things. We have other battles. We have other struggles. And I appreciate that. This isn't about them. But if men would start saying this stuff, which is what we need to be doing, you'd have more, it would create some more space. And let me just say, I'll say what's, like I didn't say it right at the beginning, the elephant in the room is, I'm a man, I come to Wiesbaden to talk about the role of men and engaging and mobilizing men. And let me just say, it wasn't a surprise to me that most of the people who came out are women. I appreciate that. There are men here, and I appreciate that. Right? But we'll know that we've made enormous progress if someone like me comes to town and it's a talk about men's violence, again, men's responsibility, and 80% of the people are men and not the other way around. Don't you think? So language, you cannot overstate how important language is for changing the conversation. And it opens up a whole new way of thinking when you start using active language and honest language. And by the way, I understand men's defensiveness, and I can be defensive. So I don't want to say that I'm some self-righteous, perfect, evolved guy. I can get defensive, believe you me. But we need to move beyond men's defensiveness if we want to get anywhere. Right? And one of the things that I've been doing in my work from the time I was a young guy was trying to figure out how do we get around men's defensiveness. And so a lot of what I'm going to do in the rest of my talk really is share with you ideas and ways I have figured out to engage and mobilize men in part by getting around the defensiveness that so many men bring to this conversation. Right? You understand? And let me just say, I'll just give you one other data point about that. I never use the word toxic masculinity. You won't hear, other than critiquing it like I just am doing right now, you'll never hear me say toxic masculinity. Because I don't think it's a useful term, personally, and I don't use it. A lot of the men that do the kind of work that I do don't use the term toxic masculinity. Because if the goal is to bring men in, to call men in rather than call them out, to bring them in, you don't want to start out by calling them toxic. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. And if people want to have a discussion about this after, in the Q&A, I'm happy to go into more detail about that. And I understand what toxic masculinity is. I understand that we're talking about all this bad behavior by men. I understand the relationship between certain normative ideas about quote unquote masculinity or manhood that contribute to all these problems. I understand it. I just think the word toxic masculinity, I don't think it works for the goals that I and others have. Just saying. Now, I've said that I think this is a men's issue. I mean, I'm arguing that this is a men's issue. And men of every racial and ethnic background, men of every socioeconomic class, not every man has the same relationship to power and social position and privilege. So we can't just say that men is a homogenous category and men need to do this without complexifying the category of men. I appreciate that too, which is why people like me and other sociologists use the term masculinities, T-I-E-S, rather than masculinity as a singular, because there's a range of different masculinities that have different relationships to power. You know, basic stuff, right? But it's important. In addition to understanding these issues as men's issues, and again, I'm making a general statement, I understand these issues as leadership issues for men. This is about leadership. Women's leadership, as I suggested earlier, women's leadership has been incredible and transformative for a long, long time. So this is not a critique of women's leadership. It's a celebration of it. The critique is of men's leadership. There's been a failure of men's leadership in Wiesbaden, in Germany, throughout Europe, in the United States, basically everywhere. There's been a failure of men's leadership for a long, long time on these matters. And I think we need to define it as a leadership issue for men. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if you're a man in a position of leadership or a young man aspiring to be in a position of leadership, you need to know that part of your portfolio has to be gender justice and gender equality, promotion and promoting it, and doing whatever you can to prevent men's violence against women and other men and children. Not because you're a nice guy helping out the women, but because you're a leader. And in the 21st century, we expect that of our leaders. And if you're a man in a position of leadership and you're not doing that, then you're not being a good leader. It's not that you're, go ahead, yeah. This narrative about good men and, helping out, that's so old school, and not old school actually. That's not even fair. It's so problematic. It's so wrong. It's not about good men helping out. It's about responsible men in the 21st century, especially those who are leaders. And by the way, you don't have to be in a formal position of leadership to exercise leadership. So I'm going to talk about formal leadership, but I also want to. In a few moments, when I talk about the bystander approach, I'm going to talk about informal leadership within peer cultures. But there are men in formal positions of leadership who have an added level of responsibility because of their status, right? And I think men in positions of formal leadership, and when I say positions of formal leadership, everything from in sports culture, in media, in politics, in business, in labor unions, in left-wing organizations, in faith communities, in communities, even in families, any man who's in a position of leadership within his sphere has to have at least a working knowledge of issues of domestic and sexual violence. He doesn't have to be an expert. That's a completely unrealistic expectation. He doesn't have to be an expert, but at the very least, he has to have a little bit of a sense of what these issues are. He has to, by the way, there's three key things that a leader in a formal position needs to think about. There's more than that, but there's three key ones. One is they need to figure out how they can support victims and survivors in their domain. Two, they need to be able to figure out how to interrupt abusive behavior and hold offenders accountable to whatever extent that's possible. And third, they need to create a climate wherein the abusive behavior doesn't happen in the first place, because they're responsible more than, the person who's a leader is responsible more than any other single person for creating and setting a tone where abusive behavior is seen as contrary to the group's values. Everybody has a role to play in doing that, but the leaders have a disproportionate role. That's why they're leaders, right? So if leaders are doing that, and if we're expecting that of leaders, The change that, by the way, that has to happen will happen a lot quicker because you'll have all these men who have influence who will be using that influence towards the good on these matters. To this day, right now, you have plenty of men in Wiesbaden, but also, in the States, everywhere, who are good men, who are in positions of leadership, who don't do a thing about these issues. And some of them will say, well, I don't rape women. This is not really my problem. Or I'm myself respectful of women, so I shouldn't have to come to some talk and hear some American, ranting about this. Right? Are you kidding me? What an impoverished understanding of leadership. Because I don't beat my wife, this isn't my issue? What nonsense. You're a leader. These are huge problems. Sexual exploitation of women in Wiesbaden, in Germany, the sexual assault, the pandemic of femicide and everything else. You're a member of this community. You're a leader. Are you kidding me? This has got to be said, don't you think? I swear to God, I travel all over the world and I state the obvious, and people think, "Oh my God, he said that." I feel like the kid in the famous story of the Emperor's New Clothes. Remember, the emperor's parading naked, and finally a kid says, "The guy's not wearing any clothes." Because everybody's scared to say the guy's not wearing any clothes. I feel like some of that is what I'm doing right now. Everything I've said is so basic, isn't it? But men don't say these things very often, do they? God. By the way, one of the reasons why men don't say these things? Because they're scared of other men. So many men are scared of other men. And I happen to have whatever gene I have, and I haven't been that scared of other men. And now I'm old, so I don't care. It doesn't really. What do I care? Can I just tell you, just a little light joke, maybe? Anybody who does the kind of work that I do, and certainly women more so than men, let me just say, get called all kinds of names online, because you have a lot of real courageous keyboard jockeys out there typing in nasty things to feminists and men like me, right? So I've been called a lot of names, but fairly recently I was called a name that I was kind of impressed by the creativity. I was called Dr. Katz Straighted. Do you get that? Katz Straighted? You see, it really broke me up. You know how ridiculous that is? I mean, it's a creative. I give them the credit. But you know how ridiculous it is? Because, the implication is that men who speak up for justice and for fairness and for gender justice and equality are soft and, weak and demasculinized and all this idiocy. And I can say it's idiocy. But a lot of young guys are terrified that other guys are going to think that they're soft. They're terrified that other guys are going to think that they took the side of women against men and the battle between the sexes, and they're weak and they're wimpy, right? Or that they're white knights, or they're virtue signalers, or they're soy boys, or all this ridiculous stuff. And it works. It keeps a lot of men silent. It keeps a lot of young men silent. Even young men who know, and they see around them stuff that they don't like. They see behavior by their peers that they know is wrong towards women, I'm saying, and they don't do anything. Why? Because one of the reasons is they've made a calculation that there's a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, there's a cost to pay in male culture for taking a stand like that. And a lot of guys make the calculation, it's not worth it. I'm not going to take a risk like that. And by the way, how are we going to expect young men to do it if older men aren't doing it? How can we expect 17-year-olds and 19-year-olds and 23-year-olds who are completely policed into conformity with their peer culture, looking over their shoulder constantly to figure out what's cool, what isn't cool? When adult men don't even say these things and don't even model the behavior. It's not fair to put the pressure on young guys in that way if the older guys aren't willing to take some risks, don't you think? God, I know that you're hot, but I'm really, really hot, right? It's really warm, isn't it? But musicians and others have to deal with that on this very stage. Isn't that true? Anyhow, So this leadership thing, identifying the issue as a leadership issue for men, one of the benefits to it is that it's positive and aspirational, right? Instead of pointing our finger at men and saying, stop doing bad things to women, we're saying, come on, guys, we need more men with the courage and the strength and the self-confidence to do the right thing. Tell your friend that the way he's talking to his girlfriend is making you uncomfortable. It's not cool. That takes guts. It takes strength. It's a positive thing. And I think a lot of men and young men can respond to a positive challenge more than they'll respond to being shamed or criticized. I'm just saying. Now, I want to share with you, and I'm going to ask Jana to help me in 1 second. I want to share with you an example of a man's leadership, and I want to give you the context for it, because it seems a little necessary to give you some context. But I know that in Andrea's introduction of me, I heard the word military somewhere in there. So you know that I work with the military. And I think I heard Manu say, this is my first time to Germany not working with the US military. Good, I'm picking up my German. I've only been here 2 days. Not really. So yeah, I've been working with the military since 1997, US military. And, my program was the first in the military. And, we can talk about this in the Q&A if people are interested. It's all kinds of contradictions. I understand the complexities of working with the military, believe me. But I and my colleagues we started working with the Australian Army back in 2013. And the context was there was a scandal in the Australian Army where a group of junior officers and junior enlisted leaders, men, all of them men, were making a series of sexually degrading Facebook posts referring to their fellow female soldiers in completely degrading and unprofessional ways. And of course, they were caught doing this because this is the digital age, and you get caught. So in addition to being ethically challenged, these guys were ignoramuses to think they were going to somehow get away with this. They didn't get away with it. And by the way, the United States Marine Corps had a similar scandal about 7 years ago. 30,000 US Marines implicated in similarly a Facebook page where they were posting sexually degrading images of female Marines and other women. Anyhow, at the time, back in 2013, the general in charge, his name was the chief of the army, his name was General David Morrison, made a videotape statement that went out to all the members of the Australian Army in response to the scandal. And I wanted to share with you General Morrison's statement in response. And you can judge for yourself whether you're as impressed by it as I am, but I'm just telling you, 10 years later, I still use it. And when I work with the United States military, I show them an Australian general from 10 years ago making the statement because it's still better than anything I've seen. I'm not saying there aren't any leaders in the US military who make important statements around this subject and who have been good leaders. There have been some. But to me, this is the gold standard, but you can judge for yourself. And I just wanted to share this with you and then come back and say a couple things and move on. So Jana, if you could please roll the Chief of Army clip.
Earlier today, I addressed the media and through them the Australian public about ongoing investigations into a group of officers and NCOs whose conduct, if proven, has not only brought the Australian Army into disrepute, but has let down every one of you and all of those whose past service has won the respect of our nation. There are limits to how much I can tell you because the investigations into this network by both the New South Wales Police and the ADF Investigative Service are ongoing. But evidence collected to date has identified a group of men within our ranks who have allegedly produced highly inappropriate material, demeaning women, and distributed it across the internet and Defence's email networks. If this is true, then the actions of these members are in direct contravention to every value the Australian Army stands for. By now, I assume you know my attitude to this type of conduct. I have stated categorically many times that the Army has to be an inclusive organisation in which every soldier, man and woman, is able to reach their full potential and is encouraged to do so. Those who think that it is okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits their colleagues have no place in this army. Our service has been engaged in continuous operations since 1999 and in its longest war ever in Afghanistan. On all operations, female soldiers and officers have proven themselves worthy of the best traditions of the Australian Army. They are vital to us maintaining our capability now and into the future. If that does not suit you, then get out. You may find another employer where your attitude and behaviour is acceptable, but I doubt it. The same goes for those who think that toughness is built on humiliating others. Every one of us is responsible for the culture and reputation of our army and the environment in which we work. If you become aware of any individual degrading another, then show moral courage and take a stand against it. No one has ever explained to me how the exploitation or degradation of others enhances capability or honours the traditions of the Australian Army. I will be ruthless in ridding the army of people who cannot live up to its values, and I need every one of you to support me in achieving this. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. That goes for all of us, but especially those who, by their rank, have a leadership role. If we are a great national institution, if we care about the legacy left to us by those who have served before us, if we care about the legacy we leave to those who, in turn, will protect and secure Australia, then it is up to us to make a difference. If you're not up to it, find something else to do with your life. There is no place for you amongst this band of brothers and sisters.
Now, can you imagine if it was normative and not exceptional to hear men in positions of influence like this talk like that and mean what they say, not checking the box, but actually passionately meaning what they say? You know what? I can imagine what our societies would look like in Germany, the United States, and elsewhere. You know what it would look like? We would have radically and dramatically reduced levels of sexual harassment, sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual exploitation, and every other form of abuse. Why do I say that? Because the typical perpetrator of these crimes and abuses is not a sick man, he's not a sociopath, he's not mentally ill or deeply disturbed. Obviously, there are those individuals, but the typical perpetrator is much more normal than that, much more average and everyday than that. By the way, that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable because a lot of people would prefer the typical perpetrator to be some monstrous, individual, because then we can dissociate ourselves from him and say, wow, that guy's just whack. That guy's crazy. What are we going to do? What are you going to do? Right? Some people invoke metaphysical abstractions to explain things like, oh, you just have to reconcile yourself to the presence of evil in the world. There's some things we can't control. And maybe there are some things we can't control, but guess what? We can do a ton more than we're doing in the material world to prevent this from happening. So invoking metaphysical abstractions is one way of not dealing with what we can really do, right? Don't you think? I mean, give me one moment. I'm trying to prevent myself from passing out, so hydration. But this idea of monsters is a really important one. Because true wisdom on these matters resides, especially those of us who are men, not in thinking about how different the men are who are committing the acts of violence, but how much, in some ways, we have in common with them, and how much they're products of our own society and our own communities. And that's much more discomforting because then we can't say that this is some external problem that we can't control or some crazy monster. It's saying we have to look in the mirror. We have to ask how each of us is playing a role in perpetuating some of the attitudes and beliefs that perpetuate these problems. And that level of introspection and self-accountability and other forms of accountability is more challenging than saying it's the other. And by the way, one of the ways racism functions in this particular discourse, for some white people, not all white people, but for some white people, is there's a comfort in thinking about the racialized other as the real violent ones. We, white people, are the good people. We don't do these horrible things, but those dark-skinned people, there's some problems. They're the ones who have the problem, right? And by the way, when white guys, individual white guys, well, when white guys commit violence, like white German men commit domestic and sexual violence, it's often ascribed to individual failings. He had a drinking problem. He lost his job. He was under a lot of stress. He had some, childhood problems, right? It's individualized. When men of color do it, it's more often attributed to, that's a cultural thing for those people. Those people that's how they deal with women in their culture. When's the last time you heard a person say, when a white German man assaulted a woman, those German white guys have a big problem with sexism and misogyny? That's a cultural thing for those white German guys, right? You don't hear that. By the way, I know that there's evolutionary reasons why groups of humans think they're the good people and the other people are the bad people. And the other people think they're the good people and we're the bad people. It's not really that complicated. And it goes deep into human history, that level of simplistic thinking about good and bad, in-group, out-group. Again, not a complicated concept, but something that we have to deal with. And we have to deal with, especially those of us who are white, we have to deal with the racism and the intersection of racism and race and gender, but certainly racism and gender violence. Because this narrative in Europe, it's a big narrative, isn't it? Is that the problem is dark-skinned men assaulting women, including white women, but not exclusively, right? And that feeds the AfD and other right-wing movements in Europe and Germany and Europe and the United States. It's one of the predictable ways that young white guys get manipulated into joining right-wing movements to be the protector of white womanhood. This is one of the older stories, isn't it? And it's totally predictable. And it ends in disaster in virtually every case, doesn't it? And are we watching some of it play out right now? We are, aren't we? It's sad and pathetic, isn't it? That in 2023, we're seeing some of the same phenomena that led this country and the world into cataclysm just 3/4 of a century ago. And these young white guys being drawn in part because they think they're on the side of righteousness. They're on the side of protecting. They're on the side of fulfilling their mission for being the protector, right? Oh my God. And by the way, I'm not going to go into the whole gun thing in the United States, but I do want to mention it because this is so much of what's happening in gun crazy America, right? It's about white manhood is what it's about. At its heart, it's about white masculinity, the gun crazy in the United States. And I mean, I've been beating this drum for a long time. It's an uphill struggle to even, by the way, even to get into the media to talk about this is so hard in the United States. Meanwhile, there's gun violence every single day. There's been 340 mass shootings in 2023 already. By the way, a majority of them have a domestic violence connection. 60% or so have a domestic violence connection. Either they're domestic violence mass shootings, where a man kills his whole family or something, 4 fatalities in one incident is considered a mass shooting in this context. Or if they're shooting strangers, there's often a domestic violence history where the perpetrator has already been abusive to his wife or his girlfriend or others. Right? I mean, this stuff is so basic, but you know how hard it is to get into the mainstream discourse in the United States to even say what I just said? It's people, even in the United States, they don't want to hear it, or either the consciousness isn't there yet, or there's resistance for some of the reasons what I said at the beginning, which is they don't want the men in the audience to think we're bashing men, so we don't want to talk about it, so let's talk about other things, like mental illness and gun availability, and just forget about the fact that 98% of mass shootings are done by men, or 99% of school shootings are done by boys. Let's not talk about that. Let's just say it's about guns and mental illness. So, I mean, my country is just totally messed up on these questions. And you know that. Anyhow. One of the things that good leaders have to do, it's the last thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to switch gears, but one of the things that good leaders have to do is they have to make connections between domestic and sexual violence and all these other social problems. And I know there are people in this room, perhaps, who are policy people, who are adjacent to policy people, who have some political agenda, not just agenda, but, platform, who knows. But I'm just saying, good leaders make connections between issues. The issues of domestic and sexual violence are not just, as we say, siloed unto themselves, like there's some separate issue. Because some people will say, well, there's a lot of important issues. You're saying this is a really important one. There's a lot of important issues. Yes, there are. Domestic and sexual violence are marbled into almost all of them. And sophisticated people, especially leaders in the 21st century, have to make those connections. And I'm just going to give you just a few bullet points. Bullet points is a violent metaphor. Sorry. Violence is everywhere in the discourse, right? You know how people say, it struck me as an insight, struck me. So having an intellectual insight is a violent act. Violence is everywhere. Anyhow, the connections that I'm talking about, I'll just give you a handful of examples. About domestic and sexual violence are marbled into gang violence, are marbled into men's violence against other men. By the way, the primary victims of most forms of violence outside of sexual violence and domestic violence, the primary victims of most forms of violence: murder, attempted murder, assault, aggravated assault, gay bashing, bullying. The primary victims are men, young men, and boys, and the primary perpetrators are men, young men, and boys. Right? Gender is all shot throughout all of this. And as I said earlier, when I talked about the domestic and sexual violence movements and the insights that they've developed and how we can apply those insights to, men and young men's lives and the violence that men do against other men, feminists have had insight into this more than almost anybody for decades. Why do you think one of the reasons why I got involved in all this stuff when I was a young guy was I was, lucky enough to get a really good education as a young guy. And I was making these connections. I was 18 years old, 19 years old. It was like making so much sense to me. Feminist ideas were making so much sense to me about my own life and the lives of men around me. It wasn't, honestly, my initial impulse wasn't altruistic concern for women. I was concerned about myself. I wanted to have a better life. And I was looking around at all these men, including myself, who had all these issues. And I was like, oh my God. Gender is at the heart of so much of these problems that we have. And there's so much of this dysfunction that I'm looking around me at. Gender is so deeply rooted. All these problems are so deeply rooted in gender. By the way, homelessness in the United States, again, I don't know about Europe and I don't know about Germany. Homelessness, like over 50% of homeless women in the United States are fleeing abusive men, and homeless women who are in the homeless or unhoused status are way more likely to be assaulted physically and sexually by men. In other words, they're way more vulnerable when they're unhoused and homelessness. Alcohol and drugs, we know that victims and perpetrators are much more likely to have alcohol and drug problems because they're self-medicating against the effects of trauma, which makes sense, doesn't it? So alcohol and drugs, mental illness, depression, all kinds of issues relating to mental health are affected by violent perpetration and violent victimization. We know, again, data is clear on this. Child abuse. We just on and on. They're all connected. And so people who are in policy-making positions, people who are thinking about, and who are leaders, who need to think about connecting these various sectors and these various groups of people and the money and the funding that goes to these things and connecting points, instead of keeping it all siloed and individual like they're discrete issues. They're not. They're all connected. Okay. Now, one of the things that General Morrison said in his statement, he said, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. Do you hear him say that? Okay, so that's General Morrison's articulation of the bystander approach. And I'm going to give you the basics of the bystander approach because as one of the architects of this approach in the sexual assault and relationship abuse field, I want to give you just an overview. And again, there's way more to it than we can possibly do in this space, but I just wanted to introduce it to you if you haven't heard of it or you haven't been familiarized with this approach, the bystander approach. Now, I'm going to use the old educational resource here. And I'm old school. I don't think there's anything better than a flip chart and an easel with a flip chart and for this purpose. And people who say to me, well, we have a really fancy overhead. It's like, I read the newspaper. Let me just, for the younger folks in here, it's called a newspaper because there's paper. Paper. Hold it in your hand. Okay. All right. So back in the day, which is the 1970s and the 1980s, when people did what they called sexual assault prevention on university campuses in the States, they arranged their thinking and their actions around this binary understanding, and it was women and men. And I understand there are more people than women and men. There's a broader spectrum of gender identity and expression and everything. I understand. Back in the day, we were talking about women and men. And when people did what they called sexual assault prevention in the 70s and 80s, they usually focused on women. And they called it prevention, but it wasn't prevention. It was risk reduction under the name of prevention. So women and girls were taught things like, don't put your drink down at a party because a guy might drop a rape drug in your drink. Look in the back seat of your car before you get in. Have a man's voice on the voicemail. If you're going to be going out with a group of friends, especially if you're going to be drinking, have a buddy system. Make sure you know who your friends are with, who they're going home with. And when you go to the bathroom, take your friend with you to the bathroom. I mean, there's a million things. Hold your keys as a potential weapon. Look under your car, look in the back seat. I mean, right? And we could go around the room, and I guarantee you, well, a lot of the women here would be like, oh my God, that's only the beginning of the list that I do every day, right? Urban, suburban, and rural. Anyhow, this is good advice when girls and women are taught to take precautions, but it's not prevention, it's risk reduction. And again, there's an important distinction. And true prevention, especially primary prevention, means going to the root cause of the problem. And guess what? Women are not the root cause of the sexual assault problem. Women are not sexually assaulting themselves. When men and boys were focused on back in the day, it was almost always as perpetrators or potential perps. So the spirit of the educational message to men and young men was, you better listen up. You better know the law in the state of Hesse about sexual consent. And you need to know if you're with somebody sexually and you're pushing forward and you're not sure if they're 100% on board and you keep pushing, you could be crossing the line into committing sexual assault. You need to back off. And when it comes to relationship abuse, if you're in say you're a heterosexual man and you're in a relationship with a woman and you're getting worked up in a relational conflict and you start thinking maybe this energy that's building is going to translate into sort of physical aggression, you need to figure out how to de-escalate, because if you let that go and you express it physically, you could be committing domestic abuse, which is a crime, and you need to figure out how to back down. Problem with focusing on men that way is, guess what? Most men disidentify with this and they think it has nothing to do with them. So men will say, why are you talking to me like this? I'm not an abuser. I don't abuse women. I resent the fact you're coming in here talking to me like this. Even men who have already done some of these things don't think that they have done anything wrong. In fact, on the university campuses in the United States, the vast majority of men who commit sexual assault don't think they've done anything wrong. They don't think they've committed rape. They don't think they're rapists. They don't think they're guilty of a criminal act. They might think that they're sexually aggressive, but within a normative range. So if you go into a room full of men with the expectation that they're going to listen to you if you talk to them like they're perps or potential perps, a lot of them are not. And a lot of them are going to resent what you're saying. Anyways, I knew all this. This is like pretty basic. And so in the early 90s, when I was in graduate school in Boston, I came up with an idea for a program to train. Initially, it was to train university male athletes. And again, I know you don't have the same system here in Germany, but we have a big system of university athletics in the States. And my idea was to train young men who are athletes to speak out on these subjects, not because there was a problem in athletics of male athletes assaulting women, although there was such a problem, and continues to be such a problem here and there. It was because I was thinking, where are we going to find young men who already have some status in their peer culture, who can use that status to open up space for other guys? Because I was thinking, if guys who have status will take some risks and step forward, it'll make it easier for other guys. That's a basic concept of leadership. The advertising industry has known this for like a century. If you want people to do something, one of the ways to buy a product, one of the ways to do it is have the person marketing the product somebody who they can identify with. And if the product is something that causes anxiety among the purchaser, you have somebody who reduces the anxiety by modeling that consumption. I mean, it's not complicated. I mean, you might even have analogs. I'm sure you do. I haven't studied this. I've studied it in the States, but not here. About, like, for example, when you have a product that produces some anxiety among male consumers, the way to market that to those male consumers is to have football players and athletes and other aggressive type of men, like, male sexual enhancement, you know what I mean? Like Viagra and stuff like that. You had these tough guys saying it's okay to use Viagra because I use Viagra and I'm a tough football player, right? Because guys are feeling anxious, right? I mean, I could go on about that one. Why do you think they name condoms after Romans and Trojans and Ramses? They name condoms after iconic, violent, powerful men because even the process of buying and using a condom is filled with anxiety for a lot of men. So you associate it with manly, Roman, Trojan. Anyhow, I'm trying to figure out how do we get more men to speak up, right? And working with athletes made a lot of sense. And so that we got funded by the United States Department of Education to create a model program. And so this is the early 90s. And so we're trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to say to these young men on football, American football, your football, hockey, basketball, baseball, lacrosse, wrestling. What are we going to say to these young men that invites them into the conversation rather than indicts them as potential rapists and abusers? And I say invite rather than indict, which is the words of Esther Solar, who's a major leader in the States on domestic and sexual violence issues. Invite rather than indict. Because like I said, back in the day when men were focused on, it was almost always as perps or potential perps. And I and others were trying to figure out how to change that, how to bring men in. Anyhow, I had a professor in graduate school who, along with his colleagues, was looking at an approach to preventing bullying among 13 and 14-year-old kids. And what they were doing was, instead of focusing on the kid doing the bullying and the kid experiencing it, they focused on all the kids around the kid doing it and all the kids around the kid experiencing it. And the idea was to get kids around the kid doing the bullying, to make it clear to that kid that what he, she, or they were doing was not cool, not because they were going to get in trouble with the authority figure, the teacher or the principal, the external agent of authority who was going to come in and remove the offending party, but because the peer culture was going to police itself. Kids were going to make it clear to other kids, you can't treat kids like this. It's not impressing us at all. In fact, you got some issues. And the goal was to get kids around the kid experiencing the bullying, to make it clear to that kid, what's going on is wrong. We don't support it. What can we do to help you? And the beauty of that approach is that everybody had a role to play. It wasn't just confined to the perpetrator and the victim. And they called that the bystander approach. And we just basically said, let's take that approach and pull it into the domestic and sexual violence world. And what it did is it gave us a great thing to say to men and young men when they say, it's not my problem, I don't rape women, I don't abuse women. It's like, okay, that's good, but it's not good enough. What are you doing to make it clear to other men around you that this is not cool, this is not acceptable behavior? What are you doing? And so the bystander approach is also beautiful because everybody in my model is a bystander, because a bystander is anybody who's not a victim or a perpetrator in a given situation or a given peer culture. Because the word bystander is just a synonym for friend, teammate, classmate, colleague, coworker. You don't even have to be there at the moment of some incident. As long as you're in a peer culture or in a community, what role can you play constructively to support victims and survivors, to challenge and interrupt abuse? And to what extent can you help to create a climate where it's not acceptable in that peer culture? So, one last piece of this, then I'm going to show you another clip, and we're heading in the home stretch. But I want to just give you this one last concept. If you can imagine this triangle as a pyramid, and you can imagine the tip of the pyramid is an incident of sexual assault or sexual harassment or domestic abuse or gay bashing or bullying. It could be racist incident, because honestly, all these issues fit into this model, but I'm talking about mostly about right now, gender violence. But that's an incident at the tip. The base, however, of the pyramid is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that don't rise to the level of an incident, but they do create the cultural foundation that supports the incident. And as you can see, there's a lot more area down here because there's a lot more happening down here than up here. And so one of the things that's happening down here is casual sexist comments, misogynist comments, group of guys are hanging out, there's no women present, one or two of the guys start talking smack about women. If you're a guy, if you don't say something and say, I'm not cool with that, in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity in their sexism and their misogyny? And don't we know that misogynist abuse doesn't just come out of nowhere. Men just don't all of a sudden, come out of the swamp and become abusers. They're produced by a society, and they're produced by a society that in many ways inculcates in them attitudes and beliefs. And there's a lot happening down here in peer cultures. And yet, the problem with focusing on down here is that it's more controversial down here than it is up here. Because what you get is up here, you get a lot of guys who will agree, rape is a horrible thing. If I see somebody being raped, I'm going to jump in, do something. Or if my friend is abusing his girlfriend, I'm going to jump in. It's not okay. And you'll say, okay, good. Well, let me ask you this: if your friend was, making negative comments about women, would you say something? Oh, what do you mean, guy? What are you talking about? What are you, some censor? What do you mean? I'm all of a sudden the guy can't even, or I can't tell a joke. I can't make jokes about this. Who the hell do you think you are? In other words, you're going to get buy-in for saying you need to intervene when you see an assault, but when you start talking about the attitudes and beliefs that help to produce the assault in the first place, you're going to get all kinds of pushback, right? And yet, I'm telling you, I think as an educator, this is really where the work happens, right here, right? Because here, I'm not saying it's easy to intervene up here. But most people don't see it. By the way, domestic and sexual violence, most of it takes place in private anyways. It doesn't take place in public. Some of it does, but most of it in private. But down here is way more common. Porn, prostitution, the sex exploitation industries that so many men participate in and support each other in participating in, that's all down here. A lot of it, right? It's harder. But again, what's our option? What's the option? To just wait for an incident, so we're going to stop an incident when we see it happening in front of us? Is that really transformative change? I don't think so. So anyhow, that's the bystander approach in a nutshell. And by the way, women can be bystanders. Women are friends, teammates, classmates, colleagues, coworkers who can see and challenge and interrupt and support and do everything like that. And then people who are not women or men, who are beyond, or either non-binary or beyond the binary, can also be supportive and interrupting abuse, and everybody can do it. I'm focusing on the men, but I'm just saying everybody can be an empowered bystander who speaks up. And let me just say I just want to say one last thing before I show you the clip, Jana, in a moment. Let me just say one of the antecedents, or one of the sort of educational approaches that I took from when I built the MVP model. And now, by the way, bystander approach is completely mainstream in the United States. It's in all 50 states, it's in legislation required, not my program, but the approach, the bystander approach is on every university campus, there's bystander programs. Some of them are directly my, work, and others are derivative, and others are different, people take it in different directions, but it's become completely mainstream. One of the places that I drew on in designing this back in the early 90s was Holocaust education, which talked about the three categories: perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. And where were the good Germans as the cars went by, and all that, right? So there should be some resonance with you all, I think, with this approach, as there is for me as a Jew, if you hadn't figured that out, that I was a Jew. That's one of the reasons why we're so subversive, because we have ideas that can actually disrupt abuse and violence and illegitimate hierarchy, so we have to be controlled. And even to this day, that's happening, isn't it? How pathetic is that? Right? Anyhow, in crisis, there's opportunity, right? This whole bystander approach, why aren't you doing it here? Why not start tomorrow? You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be my program, but just take it up. And the educational system, why isn't every kid in Germany going through school getting training on how to speak up and challenge and interrupt abusive behavior, and all kinds of abusive behavior? as a normative educational practice, not a special program. It should be in every school in Germany, shouldn't it? Every university in Germany, every university that trains teachers should be training teachers and educational administrators in all of this, right? These aren't individual problems. We're not going to run from one individual perpetrator to the next and ask what went wrong with this guy. That's not how you change the system. If it's a systemic problem, it requires a systemic solution. Anyhow. Thank you. Thank you. So, I want to show you this clip, and then I have a couple really short clips, and then I'll close off my comments, and then we'll have a Q&A, okay? So, the context of this is I've already talked about the bystander approach a little bit. I want to share with you a clip from my film. It's actually an extended trailer from the film that I and my colleagues made about the bystander approach. It just gives a little more texture. Even though you're going to hear me talking, again, there's some texture, some media culture, some other features of this piece that I wanted to share with you. And when we come back, again, there's two like real short pieces that I want to, as positive pieces that I wanted to share with you, and then I'll say some comments, final comments, and open up the floor. Okay, so Jana, if you could roll the 5-minute bystander preview, please.
Stop the violence! Stop the rape! Stop the violence! Stop the rape! Stop the violence! Stop the rape!
The Me Too movement has brought sexual assault and domestic violence into the public conversation in a way that's unprecedented.
Harvey Weinstein, charged with rape and sexual assault.
Roger Ailes is out. Bill O'Reilly out. Matt Lauer out. The head of CBS is out.
And one of the most important things that's happened with the Me Too movement is it's not just shined a spotlight on perpetrators like Harvey Weinstein, but also the people around those men and the role that they have played in participating in the culture that produces this abusive behavior.
There was also an entire culture that supports
telling them to be quiet and silent.
How do you get the change of the silent bystander to move into that engaged bystander?
And in fact, it's important to remember that one of the most important developments in the field of gender violence prevention over the past quarter century has been this focus on the bystander. But it's really important to note that there are different approaches to how you work with the bystander. And it's crucial to think about these differences because they matter.
As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, Peter's pretending to be ill. How long before he gets help?
When people hear the word bystander, they think about how people don't act when they see someone in duress on the streets.
We'll examine the bystander effect and why it may have led people to just walk on by.
There's at least 10 individuals that are standing around watching this, and no one has intervened.
But the problem with talking about the bystander effect is that has to do with strangers seeing something happening to strangers on the street. When we talk about the bystander approach, we're not talking about strangers on the street. We're talking about known peer cultures. We're talking about when they're in peer cultures where they know people, why don't they act?
2 high school football stars from Steubenville, Ohio, sexually assaulted a visibly intoxicated 16-year-old girl.
How could so many all-American kids stand by and let this happen without anyone calling for help?
And the reason why, generally speaking, why people don't act in their own peer culture is not because of their physical fear. It's because of their social fear.
Hey, let's go grind on some whores, bro.
When a young guy doesn't speak up and challenge his friend who's just made a sexist joke, it's not because he's worried about getting assaulted. It's because they're afraid of the social consequences, that they might be seen as soft, that they might be seen as not being one of the guys. Somehow their status within the peer culture might be affected.
Be cool and be kind of a dick.
Always keep your mouth shut.
Everybody likes a tattletale. Bros come before hoes.
So the question was, how can we change the peer culture support for abusive behavior, the kind of ways in which guys goad each other on, the way that guys enable each other's abusive behavior, but in particular, the way that men who don't support abusive behavior remain silent in the face of it. How does that silence function as consent and complicity in the abusive behavior? That's the bystander approach.
Rapists like dark and lonely streets where they can search out an unwary victim.
The old idea was that somehow individual perpetrators just came into town and did their nasty business and then retreated back into the darkness.
There are many things in your purse that can be effective weapons.
So you had educational videos talking about self-defense tactics women could use to fight off potential rapists.
Some people carry tear gas, mace, horn alarms, and even hairspray for self-defense.
And in fact, what's happened in the field is that some people have moved toward a more bystander intervention model that is much more about the point of intervention. Like, if you see something, say something, like the TSA in airports. The problem there is they leave out all the underlying dynamics that contribute to these problems.
Hey, baby, why don't you smile?
That skirt is way too short.
You shouldn't have had so much to drink.
Real men always want to have sex.
Boys will be boys.
Because it's not just about rape itself. Rape is on the extreme of a continuum of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are marbled into normative social practice.
Nobody forced her to drink. What did she expect to happen at 1 a.m. in the morning?
What's up, girl? How you doing? You got to call a girl. Like, hey, yo.
How would you call a dog?
Same way.
It's becoming a part of our public discourse that women are made fun of for their bodies, for their sexuality.
I would say she's in the 4 or 5 category. Right. I view a person who's flat-chested is very hard to be attacked. Grab him by the pussy. I can do anything.
Ladies out there, this is what guys talk about when you're not around. So if you're offended by it, grow up.
The point here is that you have to talk about the norms that produce those behaviors if you're going to really make substantive change. These are giant problems we're dealing with, both in the United States and all over the world. And if we're just keeping it at the surface, we're just skimming the surface, I think we're doing a disservice to young men, to young women, and we're not doing what we say we want to be doing, which is transforming the culture that produces abusive behavior.
My brothers, I feel stupid. But I am just now realizing that a lot of us men in America have been raised on rape culture.
Now, I want to share with you a couple of short clips. This next one, and by the way, that film is like 55 minutes. It's filled with all kinds of other analyses and media examples and lots of other pieces. But the next clip I want to share with you is from the American soccer star Abby Wambach, who gave a commencement speech a couple of years ago at a university in Los Angeles. And she says some things in the speech that I think in their own way support some of the things that I've been saying this evening. But I have a slight amendment to Abby Wambach's statement when we come back from it, because I have a slight difference with her, although I totally support her statement. I just wanted to share it with you to raise some important issues. So, Yana, if you could roll the Abby Wambach clip, please.
Live your solidarity out loud. I'm a member of a group that makes decisions about soccer in America. And for background, the U.S. women's soccer team has been more successful over the years than the men's team. We've won 4 World Cup championships. While the men haven't yet won one, they've got a chance this year, okay? And I will be cheering for them because one of my core beliefs is that boys can do anything that girls can do. 4 times. 4 times. So even though in American soccer, success has been female-led, most of the governing bodies are still widely and disproportionately male-led. I decided to say something about this inequity on a formal conference call. I was nervous, so I prepared in advance. I gathered up all the other women who I knew would be at the meeting and told them to be ready so we could amplify each other. The call began. I sat in my little Zoom square and looked at the 40 other little Zoom squares, mostly filled with men. And I stumbled and stammered, but I said the things. They were obvious things. And even though the bar I was proposing was so very low, not a single man on that call spoke up to support my suggestion that we begin to even the playing field. Not a single one. I got off that call feeling shaken, embarrassed, and enraged. And then this amazing thing started happening. I began to receive texts and emails from some of the men who had been silent on that call. These messages said things like, "Hey, Abby, that was really brave. I totally agree with you." Or, "Hey, loved your courage. I've got your back." I stared at those messages, "I've got your back," and I thought, do you? Do you really, Chad? Of course not. You see, Chad wanted solidarity points for silent, secret, too late solidarity. He didn't want to show solidarity when that support would have put his alignment with the Old Boys Club at risk. He wanted solidarity without risk, but there is no such thing as solidarity without risk. When a brave soul at a table dares to speak up for those not at the table, for those not yet in whatever club that table represents, do not let her fall down and then privately swear you have her back. Catch her in real time. Let us once and for all decide that there is no such thing as silent solidarity.
The one amendment that I would, friendly amendment that I would make to Abby Wambach's statement is, I do believe that there are ways that we can respond and be effective as bystanders before, during, or after the fact. It's not exactly the same, depending on when you do it, but it doesn't mean just because a moment has come that means that forever the opportunity has gone. And I'll give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. So I was doing a training at an elite university in the East Coast of the United States a few years ago, and for an athletic program. And after about 40 minutes in, when I was talking about the bystander stuff, a young man raised his hand. He was the coach of the men's soccer team, German football team. And he also said that he was a coach of a 14-year-old boys team. And he said that something happened recently in his experience where a boy on the team made a comment using the word rape completely inappropriately, like we have to rape the other team or something like that. And he said he was so taken aback by the inappropriateness of the comment that he was, he was froze and he didn't say anything. And he said to me, "What should I have said?" And I thought about it for a moment and I said to him, "Are you still the coach?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what about the next time you have practice, have the team gather around and say something like this? A couple weeks ago, one of you guys made a statement and I didn't know what to say. I was so taken aback and it was a really bad statement. And now I thought about it and here's what I want to say." And then he can talk about how inappropriate language helps to perpetuate norms that we need to challenge, that kind of stuff. So in other words, yes, he didn't say it in the moment, but he did make something useful out of it, and it didn't happen. And I think, again, I'm not quarreling with the point that if you don't do it in the moment, something has passed. But it doesn't mean you can't ever do it. What about the next time the group gets together? Those men could say, "Hey, I should have spoken up last time, but I'm going to speak up this time." I mean, the point is we're all human, and we do freeze. And I do it myself. I'm like the guy teaching this subject, and I find myself, I was talking about this in our training with Spiegelbild, I find myself in situations. I'm getting a ride to the taxi, and a taxi driver says something to me, misogynist, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm on my way to give a speech about how you have to speak up, and I just want to get to my destination, but am I supposed to say something to the taxi driver? Because how can I tell other people? In other words, it's not easy. And I'm thinking to myself, what is the cost-benefit analysis of saying something and not saying something? So I'm not saying it's easy. So I think we have to give ourselves a little bit of a break. This is hard work. And interpersonally, it's hard work. And I think a lot of guys are frozen. A lot of guys want to be supportive. And let me just say in a positive sense, there's a lot of men, not just the men in this room, but I appreciate the men in this room as well. There's a lot of men who are good people and who are supportive and who are generally supportive and are horrified by the behavior of some of our fellow men. My hope is that we get more of those men to start speaking up and start doing more than just being horrified in private or privately supporting women. They need to start challenging other men. They need to start using their voice in a more constructive way. But I think there are an awful lot of good men out there, and I totally believe this, including, by the way, in conservative spaces. And that's one of the reasons why I showed you the general from the army, the Australian Army at the beginning. This isn't I mean, even though, you know, I might have a certain politics that you probably could guess, and you might have certain politics, who knows? But this, you know, some of this you can get support beyond, you know, narrowly understood left or feminist politics. You can get men who are, for example, more conservative, but who also are horrified by some of this behavior and who can sign on to some of this work. This doesn't have to be exclusively a left endeavor, because, by the way, that'll be a failure if you want to make transformative change on a broad scale. You have to figure out how to talk across certain ideological lines and differences, right? That's why I work with the police. I work with the military. I mean, you have to work with, or if you want to make institutional change that's lasting, it has to be in the hegemonic or the dominant culture, as well as in more progressive spaces. Don't you think? But by the way, having said that, one of the things that I've learned in my brief time in Germany is there's an awful lot of progressive men and men on the left who have unchecked sexism and who get away with it because they're not held accountable by fellow lefties and progressives, which is to me outrageous. If in 2023 you call yourself a progressive and somebody who's social justice and left, and you act out in misogynist and sexist ways, you are either a complete hypocrite or you don't understand what it means to be progressive and supporting social justice. Because if you're not anti-sexist, you're not anti-social, you're not pro-social justice. All right. Anti-sexism has to be a fundamental and foundational principle on the left. But again, it also has to go beyond the left, as I've just said. All right, so my final piece is I want to end on a positive note. And a hopeful note. So I want to share with you this brief 1-minute clip, and this is a clip that that was produced by people in Scotland, and the country of Scotland runs my program in all the high school districts in the entire country as their primary violence prevention and gender violence prevention program. And I'm happy, that's a proud thing for me to say, but there it is. Scotland's a small country, but they're doing it right in this, at least in this regard. And a group of men who had gone through the MVP, that's Mentors in Violence Prevention, that's the name of my program and the model that I, talked about, the bystander approach. Anyhow, a group of men who went through the program produced a series of public service announcements that was a way to take the message to a broader audience through media, which is so critical, right? Because it's one thing to have, a talk in a room or a training with a group of people. It's another thing to reach the millions of people who have to reach. And that we have to do that through media and social media and digital technology, flat out, period, end of sentence. Anyhow, they put together this video, a series of them actually, and this is one of them. One process note. I don't know how many of you have been to Scotland. Probably some of you people have been to Scotland? Okay. So I'm a North American, and I'm an English speaker from North America. And the Scots speak English. But a lot of Americans and Canadians don't understand what, including myself, half the time, what the Scots people are saying, even though they're speaking the same language. So there's English subtitles in this video clip, even though the men are speaking English. Just thought I'd say that to a German audience. The world is a crazy place, but it's, that's what we are as humans, right? We're a polyglot. We're a heterogeneous species. So, Yana, if you could roll the Don't Be That Guy clip, please.
Like, genuinely, I do have a few pals that are a bit problematic. It is that thing of, it's going on, and we're just standing by letting it go on.
Whether it's hassling girls in the pub or inappropriate comments, we've all got that one mate that goes too far.
There are those jokes that just make me feel a little bit uncomfortable in the changing room.
Yeah, there are guys that are blatantly following women around in the gym, staring too long. If we do nothing, we're part of that issue, we're part of the problem. And the only way I can see that changing is if we talk about it.
You see it all the time. If somebody steps out of line on the pitch, you'll be quick to say something. So why don't we step in when it's a situation or a scenario like this?
Yeah, why can't we take that into issues that really matter in life?
You don't have to be the guy that calls them out in front of all your mates.
Because we know that shaming doesn't work. Trying to sort of dig people out in front of people doesn't work. Just take them aside and have a quiet word.
But I've been pulled up on behaviour plenty of times, not necessarily around women, but around my behaviour on nights out. So I know the feeling. It's quite mortifying. Like, I do get ashamed of it, and you do want to kick against that.
I mean, it might hit your ego initially, but take it on the chin. I mean, when you do step in, you're not trying to be a dick. You're doing it to look out for him. Obviously, you're looking out for everybody else in that situation, but I'm looking out for you. They're going to be more willing to receive that advice. When you've done that, you can go home, look at yourself in the mirror and actually go, you know what, this isn't right.
We're all mates at the end of the day. You know, we're all looking out for each other.
So don't be that guy who stands by and does nothing.
Don't be the guy that laughs along.
Don't be that guy that sees your mate doing something that he shouldn't be. Have a word in his ear. Be a mate.
So, we have our work cut out for us, but I know there's all kinds of potential in your community, and I have to say, in my preparation for coming over on this trip, I did some research into the Istanbul Convention, which I knew about in general terms, and I'd read summaries and stuff like that, but as a result of coming over here, and especially in my dialogue with Manuela, I read the entire text of the convention, which Germany has signed onto. You know this, and I know you mentioned it in the introduction. The Istanbul Convention is a great document to support this kind of work, expanding this kind of work. And I'm going to just read you one item. There's so much in the Istanbul Convention, okay? So I'm just going to read you one item, which I was impressed by, to be honest, when I read it. And I just want to read it to you because it supports, I think, the whole thesis of my talk tonight. This is an article, Chapter 3, Prevention, Article 2, under General Obligations. It says, number 4, parties shall take the necessary measures to encourage all members of society, especially men and boys, to contribute actively to preventing all forms of violence covered by the scope of this convention. Take the necessary measures to encourage all members of society, especially men and boys. And I want to say one word about the word encourage, because it says we need to encourage men and boys, right? To do whatever they can to prevent men's violence against women. The word courage comes from the Latin root cur, C-U-R, which means heart. In French, it's cœur, and in Spanish, corazón. Some of you might know these languages, I don't know. But cœur is heart. And so when we say courage, or we say we need to encourage men and young men, it's another way of saying we need to infuse them with heart. Because in my opinion, this is not just about intellectual aspirations. It's not just about knowledge or information. All that's important, and insight and connecting dots. Fine, that's all important, and I do it myself. Believe me. But it's not just the head. It's not just intellectual. It's also the heart. And one of the reasons why men, and so few men, have spoken up is because of the fear that they have of other men, like I said, sometimes of women, but certainly of other men, and the social disapproval of other men, and the concern that it's going to be awkward, and they're going to disrupt some kind of equilibrium within male culture, and they want to fit in, all this stuff. If we help to infuse them with heart and give them the strength and the permission to do the right thing, to be a better person, to aspire to more than just being one of the guys. If you're a guy, let me just say, if you're a guy, being one of the guys takes nothing special whatsoever. Being one of the guys as a guy is one of the easiest things you can do. What takes something special, if you're a guy, is when your guys are acting in ways that are inappropriate, is turning to them and saying, hey, this is not cool. I'm not cool with this. That takes so much more guts than going along with the group. Don't you think? So we have to say to young men, we hope that you'll be one of those people, and more than individually, but lots of them, who have the courage and the strength to say and do the right thing. And let me just say, I said it at the beginning, and I'll just repeat it as I conclude. This is, by the way, our responsibility as men to women, because the pathetic level of men's violence against women, all men should be all men of any sort of consciousness and conscience should be outraged by it and should be speaking up, because we do owe it to women and girls. There's no doubt about that. But we also owe it to men and other men and boys and people who are beyond the binary as well. We owe it to everybody who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, and should be able to grow up without being fearful of violence and sexual violence and being harassed and abused and discriminated against. Everybody should have that right, don't you think? That includes men and young men. And there's never been a contradiction between supporting feminist goals of empowering women and creating justice and caring and concern for men and men's integrity and men's physical inviolability. There's never been a contradiction between the two, but we have to say that loudly. And especially in the current political climate in your country and my country, we need to tell young men a story that they're going to be able to relate to from a progressive and pro-feminist side. Because what they're hearing from the other side is open arms, welcome, we welcome you, we want you, we support you, you are the people who built Western civilization, and we want you on our side, and we respect you, and those people hate you, and feminists think you're shit, and we love you. If young men are hearing that, especially young white men are hearing that, one side is saying, we love you and you built Western civilization, and the other side saying, you're toxic and we hate you, guess what? A lot of those guys are running into the arms of the right, and we know where that leads. We have to tell a better story. And the better story on our side is you want to be a part of justice and fairness and decency and building a multiracial, which we have, a multiracial society for the 21st century, and using everybody's strength. And you have a positive role to play in that. And yes, it's complicated, and we're going to have to work with some of the complications, because it's more complicated on the left than it is on the right, because you have to navigate privilege and power, and the right doesn't care about that. But we do. But we have to tell that story in a way that these young men are hearing, or we're really in deep trouble. And I feel like, yes, we're talking about domestic and sexual violence, but the bigger picture here is we have to preserve democracy. And we have to preserve democracy by pulling some of those white guys back to the side of justice and fairness. Good luck to you, and thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. In English. Okay.
Questions in English.
Okay. So they have to?
Yes.
Okay, so you.
We translate.
Oh, we translate. That's a bit wishy-washy now. Okay, so now for the Q&A, we have like spot for 3 questions, because we're a bit late. We're running a bit late, but yeah, I think three questions should be cool. Because yeah, okay, 13:30 müssen wir raus sein. We have to leave in like 10 minutes. Okay, so, and who wants to start? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I like your talk. The question that I have is, we all see the importance of taking the courage and doing the stuff, talking to your guys that's not cool to do these jokes, to do these comments, or to even do some bad things. The question that I have, that the fear of being bullied because of that is grounded. What can you suggest to those men who are in those groups that don't like the courage, don't like your point of view, that are being bullied for that? Is my question clear, or should I say?
It might be a little unclear. Is there somebody? Can you say it in German?
No, I'm from Ukraine. I don't say.
Okay. Yeah. For the boys, for which I appreciate your asking the question.
An example that would make it clear. So in the school, I'm in the school.
Yeah.
And right now in my class, there is a group of boys that bullies another one, and the people in this group are making like it's a fun. If you're not doing it, you're not cool.
Right.
And if you say and stand up, what are the risks and should you do it?
Right. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the question. Good job. Are you a high school student or a university student? That's impressive. I'm impressed that you're here, by the way. That's awesome. I have to try to be brief. Unfortunately, it's not one of my skills. But because of time, it's an important question. I would say the most important thing in a school is that the adults have to be in charge of preventing bullying, and it shouldn't be on kids to take the risks. It should be on the adults. And if the adults aren't intervening and setting the tone and holding accountable people who are mistreating others, the adults are failing at being good educational leaders. And it should never be on the shoulders of the kids alone. It should always be on the shoulders of the adults. Having said, I hope you agree with this. This is a fundamental thing. Yeah. But people have to also be safe. And so I'm not asking anybody to take risks with their personal safety. And so when you want to speak up and intervene, you have to do it smartly and not just trying to be heroic, because sometimes you can put yourself at risk by doing that. So I wouldn't want to isolate it to an individual. This is not an individual problem. This is a school-wide problem. And for example, in the MVP, in my teaching and my model, we're not working with individual young people. We're working with schools. We're working with whole teams and whole classes, because everybody needs to know that there's a shared set of values in the school, and the shared set of values is we treat each other with respect, and when somebody doesn't treat another person with respect, everybody should be invested in preventing that from happening, because the person who's acting disrespectfully, who's bullying, is actually doing that against the values of the group. Not just against the person, they're doing it against the values of the group, because the group says we care about each other and we respect each other and you don't harm other people. And if you do, you're going to get in trouble, not just with an individual, but with the group. So I would take it out of the hands of the individual. I wouldn't want to put the pressure on you or anybody as an individual to fight against a group of bullies, if you know what I'm saying. It has to be understood as a school issue. And so one of the concrete things is find an adult in the school who's a supportive person and ask them and say, look, Mr. such and such, Ms. such and such, I just need you to know that this is going on and it's not cool, but I don't really know what to do, because the adults should be dealing with it. And it's an act of leadership on the part of a young person to find out who the adult is in the space, who's the most supportive, and find that person and ask them to do something. That's what I think. But I appreciate your question. Any other questions or concerns?
Here was another question.
Oh, okay.
I don't know how much time we have.
Okay,
but
I'll try to be quicker. I'll give you a lightning round.
It's actually not much of a question, it's a comment, but I try to keep it shortly.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for your presentation and being here. I work at this cultural center at Schlachthof, and we just wanted to give the audience and you the hint that in the frame of your presentation, we did something that we've been planning for the past few months. We hung up a banner at this side of the building saying Woman, Life, Freedom in 6 different languages. That is English, Persian, Turkish, Arabic, Kurdish and Ukrainian as a sign. It did, like the impulse, just a short background to this action. The impulse was given to us by two Iranian friends that were exiled to Germany a long time ago. And we've been planning this with the group of people that were organizing something around the 8th of March, the Feminist International Action Day. So this is just a little sign of solidarity against patriarchal violence and as a sign of solidarity with feminist battles all around the world, especially the Kurdish freedom movement and in this case, the Iranian battles against the Islamic Republic. And we chose this very date today to hang it, and we just want, yes, that's the last sentence I wanted to say, just to let everybody know. And if you want to have a look at it, it's at this side of the building. Keep up the good work, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and there's one person.
Yes, I have only a question. What do you think? Sorry, it's too far. About Donald Trump and violence against women.
What do you think? I think. No, I appreciate it. I could go on for like ever about this question. So I appreciate the question. I have to be short because of time, but I mean, I think Donald Trump is an embarrassment, is a stain on the United States history. It's an outrage that he was the president, as far as I'm concerned. And if he's become the nominee for the Republican Party in 2024, which right now is very strong possibility, we're going to have a phenomenon where the American voters are going to go to vote for somebody who is not just alleged to have been a misogynist abuser for 30, 40 years, which he has, by the way, been alleged to have been a misogynist abuser for 30 or 40 years. Not a recent problem with Donald Trump. But we would be voting for a person who's actually lost a court case where the civil action against him found that he was a sexual assaulter. He wasn't found guilty of rape, but he was found guilty of sexually assaulting E. Jean Carroll in a court of law in a jury trial, which means that the people voting for him are voting for somebody who has lost a court case on a sexual assault, in addition to all the other allegations of women that claim that he sexually assaulted them, in addition to the untold numbers of women that he has acted out in sexist and misogynist ways towards for 40 years as a public figure. If 75 million people vote for him in spite of all this, that's what we're dealing with in the United States right now. That the statement that makes, it's already made that statement by him being elected in 2016, but it's even worse now if 75 million people vote for him, even if he loses. And I'm not a religious person, but oh my God, I pray to God that he's not elected president, because it's a nightmare if he's elected president. I'll say that for the public record, not care. I mean, that's what I think. I think it's an outrage that he's a leader in my country. And I'm embarrassed. And I've written about this for years. And by the way, I made a film about this. It's called The Man Card, White Male Identity Politics from Nixon to Trump. And it's a whole analysis of how white men have been, in the American political system, have been sort of marketed to by the Republican Party for the past 50 years, and successfully. And some of the same phenomenon is in your country. Right-wing populism has lots of features in common, and one of them is it's not just about racism. It's also men who feel decentered by feminism, and heteronormative men who are feeling decentered by the LGBTQ challenges to heteronormative masculinity. And the narrative that it's only about race is incorrect. It's race, but it's beyond race. It's also about gender. And yet the gender piece gets left out of the conversation, and the anti-feminism that is undergirding Trumpism and the rise of right-wing populism in Europe has got to be part of the public discourse. Don't you think?
Okay, I've been told we've got time for one more question. Okay. Is it? I give it. Great.
You can ask it too.
It's not particularly a question. I thought your Scottish video was great, and it was just how you can reach the people, and that is the particular point in Britain. As soon as you did the pyramid, that is what they do. They have the public information films in the various styles, similar to your Scottish one, not with Untertitel, and they do young lads, they wolf whistle at some girls, and the others say to them, "Do you think that's right?" And in a very short 20-second, 30-second clip, different clips, and it's shown on national TV day in, day out. And that's the best way to reach people, as well as in schools. But that clip really does do it, so well done for your work there.
I appreciate that. And can I quickly tell you, and she's going to get a chance, even though I'm going off the menu here because she's in the front row and she was raising her hand. But a point of personal interest, perhaps, but certainly something that I'm happy about. I'm having a book published in London in May of 2024 about violence against women as a men's issue, and it's being published by a major publisher, and so it's going to be hopefully in a big stage in London and in the English-speaking world come spring of 24. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about here is going to be in this book, and it'll be published in London by Penguin Random House. So I'm happy about that. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. One more question.
We can do it just the two of us. I mean, no, my question is like, I could ask it to Greta Thunberg as well. Like, how do you do it? I'm in education also, and it's also, it was great work, but it was basic, like you said, all the time. It's like basic human being you're teaching. Like, how do you keep up working since the 90s? Like, without getting angry, because then you're like, scaring people away. Like, how do you do it? Because I want to do it, but I'm a very impatient person, and I really want to know, like, a method. Like, do you meditate? Do you have good nutrition? Like, how do you do it?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. No, I mean, it's a good question. And I think that's true for people in, not just as educators, but people who are involved in social change work, because you have to be sustainable. Your energy has to be sustaining or people burn out. And I appreciate, yes, mentally. But I would say, this is basic, again, basic, but you have to have support. You have to have friends. You have to have community. You have to have people that support you and that love you and that you're comrades with, or, you know what I mean, allies with and supporters. And, I have a kind of a blessed existence because I have a network of people both in my own immediate circles, but globally, you know what I mean? I connect with these great people at Spiegelbild and Manu and people like that here. And there's people everywhere who are doing this great work. And if you're connected to people, you feel like you're not alone, And I get more back than I give out. So that's an important part, yeah. And by the way, let me just say, I'll conclude by saying, and I said it already, but this is special to me to be here in Germany as a Jew talking to you about this, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the official end. I will do a part in English because it was a pleasure having you here and getting to know you and getting to know your work. And thanks for your time. And now I do the rest in German.
Okay.
Also auch danke.